The session is called Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which will be a conversation between Laurie Gottlieb and Shravanti Bagchi, discussing Laurie's book, a New York Times bestseller, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. For brief author profiles, we have Laurie Gottlieb, a psychotherapist and a best-selling author of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which has sold over 1 million copies and is currently being adapted into a television series. Maybe You Should Talk to Someone is published in India by Amaryllis, an imprint of Manjul Publication House. Laurie is also the co-host of the popular Dear Therapists podcast and writes the Atlantic's weekly Dear Therapist column. And her TED Talk, How Changing Your Story Can Change Your Life, was one of the top 10 most watched of 2019. Laurie will be in conversation with Shravanti Bagchi, a writer and editor at Mint. Over to you, ladies. Thank you.
Hi, Laurie. Nice to meet you. Laurie, right? Not
Yes.
Laurie. Laurie, yeah.
Laurie, yes.
Yeah, I've read your book, enjoyed it a lot. Let me just tell people a little bit about it. So, Laurie is like, we mentioned in the introduction, she's a trained psychotherapist. And this book is basically a memoir of her journey as a psychotherapist of a particular time in her life when she herself is a practicing therapist and is in therapy herself. So this is about sort of, lifting the veil from the whole process of therapy and coming at it from both ends as a therapist herself and as a client of a therapist who is also going through her own issues in life and is trying to, get to the bottom of what is causing them. So, Laurie, to start off with, I mean, the process of therapy has always been sort of shrouded in a bit of secrecy, mystery, mystique. Over the last 1 year, I watched one of my favorite shows was In Treatment, HBO's In Treatment, which is about this therapist who is seen also as a patient himself. And then I read your book, and which is again, gives a great insight into the whole process of therapy. What do you think, is leading to at least people kind of be willing to go behind the scenes of therapy? And why has it always so far seemingly, been shrouded in this whole thing? Is there a reason why therapists don't like to sort of reveal the tools of their trade?
Yeah, I think that it's really important that people understand what the experience is like of being in therapy and how it can help them. And so I say at the beginning of Maybe You Should Talk to Someone that my most significant credential is that I'm a card-carrying member of the human race, meaning that I am just a person who is going through the world like everybody else. I don't think that therapy should be shrouded in mystery. I think that people should understand that really, yes, we use our training and our, all of the tools and all of the skills that we have been trained for, but mostly it's really a relationship. And I think it's a very transformative kind of relationship when done well. So it's not that we want to keep secrets from someone. I think it's more about we want to be open about what we're doing. So in the book, I'm very open all the time about what I'm thinking when a patient is doing something or saying something, or why I've decided to respond in this way to this patient. What does it mean when, something that a patient says resonates with me, and how do I handle that in the room? I think it's really important for people to understand it, because if they don't understand it, they won't understand how it can help them.
Right. So just following up from that, how much of the experience of being in therapy yourself do you bring to your practice as a therapist? I mean, do you have a special empathy with patients because, you yourself have been through that? Like what part of that experience, comes into your practice?
I think that when you get to know somebody and they show you the truth of who they are, you can't help but empathize with them. You might not have experienced exactly the same thing, and most of the time we haven't, but we know what it's like to struggle. We know what it's like to feel anxious or to worry about something, or to feel sad about something, or to feel angry, or to feel grief or loss. These are universal human experiences. So I don't think that you need to have had the same experience as your client to really be able to connect with them. And I think what the connection is, it's a very primitive, it's like it's not something that you have to force. It's just this connection that we have as human beings when somebody is being open with you. Now, I will say that when people are not being open, it's very hard to connect with them. So often people will come to therapy and they say that they want to be helped, but they're not telling you the whole truth, maybe because they have some shame around what the truth is, or they want to be liked and they're worried that if they tell you something about themselves that you won't like them, which is not true. Actually, the more that they can show you who they are, the more likable they become, the more human they become.
Yeah. You write about unreliable narrators a lot, in your book, because you're also narrating your own story through this. And of course, there are parts that you probably, keep aside. We are all the unreliable narrators of our lives, right? And that is a theme that you touch upon again and again in your. So, how does being an unreliable narrator of your own life sort of hold yourself back? And how do we change the way? That's also one of the podcasts, you talk about it in your podcast as well, like how we can change the story of our lives. Do you think that's really possible? And if yes, in what ways is it helpful?
I think that we make sense of our lives through story. You think about what we talk about every day and we say, look what happened at work, or look what happened with this family member, or look what happened in this interaction with my partner, right? So that's how we make sense of things, through stories. Often we have stories, though, that are unreliable in the sense of we're telling our subjective version of the story. And if you were to ask the other people involved in the same interaction what their version of the story is, it might be very different, or they might have experienced different things. And so I think that I see this with couples all the time when I have couples come in for counseling, and I see that one person thinks that an experience was like this and the other person thinks it was like this. And it's not about who's right or wrong. They're both right. They both experienced it in a particular way. I think in therapy, people can get in their own ways if they don't look at the stories they're carrying around. Sometimes we carry around our own stories that are unreliable. Like if we have evidence for two things, say you have evidence for the story, I'm lovable, but you also have evidence for the story, I'm unlovable because somebody did not love you. Weirdly, we seem to gravitate toward the one that's going to make us feel bad, right? So the story we end up carrying around is I'm unlovable. Same with stories like I can't trust anyone, or, everybody's life is better than mine, or nothing will ever work out for me, or whatever story you're carrying around. Sometimes we don't even realize not only are these stories inaccurate, but they hold us back because they color every choice, every decision, every behavior of ours is colored by that story. So I think it's really important for us to untangle those. So I wrote a companion workbook to Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which takes people through the process step by step as a guide of how do you look at these stories? How do you figure out what they are? And then how do you make them more accurate so that they don't get in your way?
So, what are some of the ways that we can stop telling ourselves the negative stories, stop picking on things that are sort of that confirmation bias of negativity, if I may call it that, like which kind of bolsters our what comes first? I mean, choosing to not be negative about yourself, or realizing that you are that there are these patterns in your thought.
I don't think it's about being negative or positive. I think it's being more about seeing yourself more clearly. And that means seeing things that you want to work on that maybe you don't like as much about what you do. And then also seeing the things that maybe you don't give enough credit to in your own life. I always say when I'm in person, I'll often say to people, and I can see the audience, I'll say, raise your hand. Who's the person that you talk to most in the course of your life? Is it your partner? Is it your best friend? Is it your sibling? Is it, who is it, your parent? Who is it? And I get a lot of hands for that, but most people don't think that the person that we talk to most in the course of our lives is ourselves. Yeah. And what we say to ourselves isn't always kind or true or useful. So when we talk about the stories and the accuracy, is it kind? Is it true? That's where the story comes in. And is it useful? How does this serve us? So I had this patient who came in and she did not realize how self-critical she was. And I said, I want you to go home and I want you to listen to how you talk to yourself. And I want you to write down everything you say to yourself about yourself over the course of the next few days. And then we'll talk about it next week when you come back. And when she came back the next week, she had written down everything and she started to read her list. And she said, I can't even read this. I am such a bully to myself. And there were things like she was typing an email and she had made a typo and she said, oh, you're so stupid. That was the voice in her head talking to herself. If any of her friends had made that same mistake in the email, she would not say, they're so stupid. She would not think that about them. She caught a reflection of herself in a mirror and said, you look terrible today, right, to herself. This is sometimes we don't realize the stories that we're telling ourselves about ourselves. We can be so incredibly unkind to ourselves. So I always say to people, the first step in rewriting your story is look at, is it kind? Is it true? Is it useful?
That's so true, Lori. I mean, we are often kinder to other people than we are to ourselves, and I think that compassion begins with us. Yeah, and you do talk a lot about this the self compassion. But I just had a question about, I mean, is self-compassion forgiving yourself for everything that you may actually have done wrong? And is that not a bit like, not taking responsibility for your actions, not, always blaming things on other people? Because we all have those people in our lives who are always, saying, oh, my mom did this, so that's why I turned out like this, or, this friend betrayed me. Maybe they don't always also see what they may have done to sort of push that situation along. So is self-compassion, can it also lead to not taking responsibility? And how do you balance those?
Yeah, self-compassion has nothing to do with not taking responsibility. In fact, you will take more responsibility and have more accountability for your actions if you can be compassionate. The reason that people don't take responsibility for their actions is because of shame. So what happens is people feel so much shame around what they did that they want to blame other people. They want to, say that they weren't responsible for it. They don't want to look inside. They don't want to look at themselves. They don't want to change their behavior because then they have to admit that they have a problematic behavior. The way that you can deal with problematic behavior in yourself is to have compassion for yourself, to say, it's okay that it doesn't make me a bad person. It means that I want to change something about my behavior that is not working in my relationships or is not working in my world, right? And so when you are doing the opposite, when you don't have self-compassion, then you basically go underground. You decide, I'm not going to even look at this. If you have self-compassion, you're able to look at it. And then once you're able to look at it, you're able to change it.
Right. So it just gives you more clarity on everything, like on your actions, on other people's actions, all of that, right? Yeah,
yeah, I mean, think of it like, if your child came to you and said, I did this thing, or you say to your child, like, you did this thing and that's not okay. You can shame the child, or you can have compassion for the child and also hold them accountable and say, now that we know that this is the problem, what do we do about it? You can't change a problem unless you're actually willing to acknowledge the problem. And I think that's where you can be compassionate and you can be responsible at the same time.
Right. That is such useful advice, Lori. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, in fact, this is, it's quite uncanny. I edit a magazine and I was just editing a story last night about, the cult of happy. So apparently over the course of the last couple of years in India, there are many happiness coaches, like this whole industry has kind of come up. I know that in the US, it's quite probably, more common. Do you think we are in a cult of happy? Like, do you think we are, addicted to happiness?
Right. So I write, and maybe you should talk to someone about how I was supposed to be writing a book about happiness, and I couldn't write that book because I don't feel like that is what the goal is. And what I mean by that is happiness as a byproduct of living our lives with purpose and meaning. Is, I think, a worthy goal. I think that's what we all want. But happiness as the goal in and of itself is kind of a recipe for disaster because it's not hinging on anything. It's empty. So I think, where do we get joy? Let's use the word joy instead of happiness. Where do we get joy? We get joy from meaning, from connection, from, those kinds of things that really fill us up. And that's very different from happiness. Seems to be a very individualized type of thing. And I think that when we talk about, joy, I think that tends to come from these things that have to do with us in relation to others.
Right. And speaking of joy, I mean, there are so many sort of now we are in the age of, Instagram therapy, right? I mean, people who are on social media and they give these small nuggets of, sort of wisdom on Instagram. They are qualified therapists and, of course, in their own right. But how useful is it? How deep is it? Is it meaningful at all? Do you see meaning and use in that? Or could it also be a little harmful in some situations?
I think that using, quote cards on Instagram to decide on, how to live a fulfilling life is probably not going to have the result that you want. And I think that, it can be a drug in a way too, right? It's a distraction. So when you think about a lot of times what we do with our feelings, whatever we're feeling, if you're feeling lonely, if you're feeling empty, if you're feeling sad, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feling like maybe I want to leave my relationship, but I'm afraid to do that, whatever you're feeling, we say, oh, I don't want to feel that. So I'm going to just numb that out. I'm going to pretend it's not there. But the thing about our feelings is that they come out in other ways. And sometimes it's maybe your feelings come out in too much food or not enough food or too much alcohol or a lack of sleep or a short-temperedness in relationships or that mindless scrolling through the internet, right? Where you're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and you think that you're doing something to kind of feed yourself, but actually you're just reading quote cards or, whatever it is, or you think you're sort of having relationships or connection that isn't really connection. It's not the same. And I think we all saw during COVID, the difference between face-to-face real life connection and, what happens mediated through a screen. So I think that it's really important that people understand, how is this useful? What are they getting out of it? And what is the purpose in doing this? And I think that if people really want to do the work, they should sit face to face in a room with a therapist and really understand themselves. And that's going to be a completely different experience from scrolling through Instagram.
Yeah, I would tend to agree with you there. I mean, there's nothing like sitting face to face across from a therapist and talking. But do you think it also like sometimes, maybe pushes people to sort of explore that or opens their minds to therapy? Or, I mean, what's your take on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, that just like most things, nothing is sort of, the internet is not all good or all bad. I think that it does a lot of good. And I think one thing that it does is it normalizes the fact that people struggle. So when people share about their experiences, it gives you a sense that, oh, you know what, I'm not alone. And I think before we had the internet, a lot of people felt like they were alone in what they were going through. And so I think that you can see that, first of all, people are starting to talk more about emotional health. People are realizing that they have to prioritize it, that it's not optional. It doesn't come after everything else. Just like our physical health, we need to take care of our emotional health. And that they're related too. So I feel like it's done a lot in terms of access and in terms of normalizing and reducing stigma.
Right. Laurie, just going back to what you were talking about, that how during COVID we realized the importance of, actual physical connections. So just talking about the pandemic a little bit here, what kind of shifts in sort of, mental health and what kind of shifts in the practice of mental health do you think we'll be seeing, and also the fact that we've all kind of gone through this collective trauma of, constantly being on edge, of hearing bad news every day and of, hearing of people close to you. I mean, probably losing people very close to you or somebody you don't know that well. But, so there's this whole collective grief that we are holding. How do we deal with it? How do we emerge from this?
I think that one of the things that it really has, shown us is that we can deal with uncertainty. And also that when we have something, a period of uncertainty like this, it really makes us reevaluate what's important to us. And for a lot of people, they started to say, at least here in the US, a lot of people started to say, you know what, I used to commute an hour and a half to work every day, right? And I lost all that time. And now that I'm working from home, I would like to figure out a different way to do this. Maybe I go in some days, but I stay home other days and work from home. We're really looking at quality of life. We're really looking at what's important to us. Given that, mortality was in our face every day. So we saw people die. We still see people die every day. And I think we could compartmentalize that before, but now that it was happening all around us, we could not compartmentalize it anymore. And so I think that you start to reevaluate and say, what is important to me? How do I want to live my life? Not in the future, but right now, every day. So who are the people who are important to me? What are the relationships that are important to me that I want to nurture and prioritize? And then what are some of the relationships that maybe really were not serving me and I don't need to kind of put my energy in that direction? I think we were, really evaluating our relationships, evaluating, how we are in our families and how much family time we spend, evaluating whether we're doing work that is meaningful to us, evaluating what our quality of life is in terms of our professional lives. So I think all of those are important questions we should have been asking anyway, and the pandemic really put them front and center for us.
Right. And but do you think there is going to be like, are we going to emerge from COVID mildly traumatized for life?
I think that people who experienced earlier trauma will experience a new trauma kind of layered on the earlier traumas. So everybody's different. And I think when we talk about the collective, I don't think that you can really make generalizations. I see therapy patients who have very, very different reactions to what we're going through and what we've been through. I also think there's no hierarchy of pain or of grief. So, what some people might say, oh, it was really hard for me to be inside and I didn't get to go to, my book group that was really important for me. And I didn't get to do these things that are part of my life and my connections. And other people were like, I lost my parents or, I lost, right. And so people would say, well, that person who didn't get to go to book group doesn't get to talk about how lonely they were and how isolated they were because at least they're healthy and their family's healthy. But there really is no hierarchy of pain, meaning I think that everybody experienced losses in different ways. And we really need to allow people to talk about the losses that they've experienced. And we can't really judge, which ones merit conversation and which ones don't.
That is such an important point, the hierarchy of pain and, how as a society, we are always told, to get over it or like, look, you're luckier than other people. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that is not a useful way to deal with anything. I mean, and we start telling that to ourselves also, right? That, oh, look at X and, they lost a close family member and you're just, moaning about not being able to go to work or feeling lonely. I mean, so you're saying that that's not a great way of framing the whole thing.
Well, right. I mean, comparative grief or comparative pain is never helpful. And I think that, loneliness is really serious. So when people say, oh, you were lonely, well, but at least you didn't lose someone or you didn't get COVID or whatever it might be. If you read about loneliness, the studies, loneliness is as impactful on our health as heart disease, cancer, all of these things. It can really impact us over time. It's a real public health crisis. And even here, the Surgeon General of the United States has written about loneliness and its impact on our culture and on us individually as well. It's a real epidemic. And I think that people minimize it because they think, well, what's so bad about that? I think that we really have to reconsider what our priorities are.
Right. I had a question. I mean, going through your book, certain things sort of stand out. And one of them is, the different ways in which sort of men and women react to therapy. I mean, do you think that there is a difference between, men and women in therapy, how they respond? And I've always wondered about this. How does the gender difference between the client and the therapist sort of play a role in that?
Yeah. I mean, these are generalizations, but I can say generally, in our culture, I think it's very hard for men to feel like they're allowed to be vulnerable. And so, men will come in and they'll say something like, I've never told anyone this before. And they literally have not told a soul, not their best friend, not their partner, not their family members, not their sibling that they're very close with. They've told no one. Women will come in and often they'll say something like, I've never told anyone this before, except for my mother, my sister, my best friend, right? So they've told a few people, but they feel like they haven't told anyone. And I think that really speaks to this difference in terms of what is acceptable, and how vulnerable we can be, whether you're, male or female, right? And I feel like part of the problem, is we think, oh, we want men to have the freedom to be as vulnerable as women. But what happens is a lot of times women get in the way. And what I mean by that, so it's not just men. People think, oh, it's the men who don't want other men to open up, or they're very uncomfortable with it. When I see couples, and if it's a heterosexual couple, and, usually the woman will say something to the man like, I really want to get to know you better. I want you to open up to me. I feel like there's this distance between us. And so then he opens up, and maybe he even sheds a tear or lots of tears and starts crying. And she gets visibly uncomfortable. You can see that her body tenses up. She looks to me like, what do I do with this? I didn't realize he was going to cry, right? And so, what is that message that we're sending to men? On one hand, she's saying to him, I want you to open up. I want you to tell me how you feel. I want to feel closer to you. And on the other hand, I get really uncomfortable when you are that vulnerable with me. So I think that makes it very hard for men to figure out, who can I talk to and how and in what context. And so when men come into therapy, people have this idea, oh, men, they don't really think about their emotions the same way. Oh, yes, they do. And they have a very deep well of emotions, and they struggle with many of the same things that the women sitting on my couch struggle with. So I want people to really create that space for men to open up and be vulnerable and talk. And if you're a man listening to this, to really know that you can go to a therapist and you can talk about these things, and that therapist will help you talk to the people in your life about the things that you want to talk about.
Yeah. And suppose they don't want to go to a therapist, but in general, like, how do we tell men to talk more about their feelings?
I think that they have to just do it, right? So it's like you can think about it all day long, but if you're not doing it, and you have to choose your audience well. And what I mean by that, and I would say that to anybody, this is like a gender-free comment, which is that you always have to choose your audience well. So many times people will come to therapy and they'll say, well, I tried to talk about what was going on with me to so-and-so, but that person is not available to them in that way. That person is not a good audience for you. So who is a person that is going to really just sit there with you and be present with you? They don't have to fix it. In fact, you probably don't want them to fix it. You just want to go to them. You want to just tell them, this is what's going on for me. And you just want them to sit there with you in that moment, in that connection. Who's that person for you? That's the person you should go to. And if you're worried about it, you can say, hey, I know I don't normally come to you and talk about these things, but I was thinking about these things that I want to share with you. Are you okay with that? Is there a good time for us to kind of sit down and talk? So they aren't sort of caught off guard.
Right. It reminds me of this article I read about how men, treat their wives as kind of wives and girlfriends as everything, like all in all, because they never talk to, their friends about feelings and emotions and things like that. So, the women in their lives, their mentioned partners sort of become, everything, and have to bear this whole emotional load of responding to them. Do you think that's a fair assessment, or are we being unfair to men?
I think in general, people consider here in the United States, at least, people think, I'm going to marry this person, they're going to be my soulmate, and they're going to be my everything. And what I mean by that is they're going to be my best friend, and they're going to understand me, and they're going to, we're going to have all these different kinds of connections, and and then we're going to have this great physical connection and all of these things. And yet we need different people in our lives for different things. So, there's the marriage, and there should be all these great things in the marriage, but they're not the only people that are close to you in your life. And for people who have other close people in their lives, their marriages are stronger. So if you have a best friend who is not your partner, right? Your partner is your best friend in certain ways, but you might have other people that you talk to about really personal things. Or you might have a person, maybe your partner doesn't share a certain interest of yours. And so maybe you have someone else that you share that interest with, right? Because you like to read these books, or you like to go to theater, or, whatever your interest is. And same with your partner. You don't have to share every single interest. So I think that we put too much pressure on what this person is supposed to do for us, as opposed to what it means to love and be loved. What does that mean? Just that right there. What does it mean to love and be loved and go through life together? And it's very different from, I think, a lot of the expectations that people have going into marriage.
That's really a wonderful insight, Lori. I mean, that's really great. And just shifting gears a little bit, I believe, I mean, maybe you mentioned it in your podcast, or, you said, so over the pandemic, we didn't have access to physical therapy. I mean, not physical therapy in the sense of, move your arms and legs, but sitting down with a therapist across a table, on the couch and like talk. So, of course, we all moved to online therapy. We spoke to our therapists, via Zoom or Google Hangouts or whatever. So I've heard that you call this, Skype therapy, therapy with a condom on. What do you think? I mean, do you think it's really true that, there's something lost in that process?
So first of all, that was what a colleague said. So I was quoting a colleague, and we were talking about, this was before the pandemic. So the book was published, when I wrote the book, I did not know we were about to have a pandemic. And we were talking about online therapy and how, this colleague had said it's like doing therapy with a condom on, meaning it's not the same as sitting in a room face to face, a few feet away from somebody, where you're both experiencing just the ritual of that, and all of the cues and signals that you see in person and that you hear when you're in the same space. But what was surprising during the pandemic was how effective online therapy seemed to be. I don't think it will ever be the same as being in a room with somebody. But what was interesting was you got certain things that you don't get in the room with people. So I have this patient that I'd been seeing for a while. And when I got onto online therapy with her, I noticed in her background that there was a cello. And I just happened to say, whose cello is that? And she said, it's mine. And then I started asking her about it. It turns out she plays every day, and it was a really important part of her life. And she had just never mentioned it. Now, maybe it would have come up later in therapy, but the fact that I saw it there brought that up, right? There was another moment early on in the pandemic when a lot of people, they didn't have private spaces in their houses because everybody was home. So the kids and the partners and the sometimes multi-generational families, and there was no space for them to just go and talk somewhere privately. So they'd go in their bathrooms and they would close the door and put this toilet seat down and sit down. And this one woman was crying because her mother was in a nursing home. She was in assisted living, and they had just had a case of COVID, and she was really worried that her mother was going to get COVID and die. And she was crying hysterically, and she was crying so much that her whole body moved, and she leaned back and her elbow went back and it flushed the toilet. And it was this moment that was, it was just something that obviously would never happen in the office. And she laughed and I laughed. And even though we were talking about something incredibly distressing, and at the end of the session, she said, everything we talked about today was really helpful, but the most helpful part of the session was when we got to laugh together, because it reminded me of what I'm like before all of this and what I will be like again. And so there are these moments that happen online where I see family members that I've only heard about, and now they walk through the background, or I see pets and they jump up on the keyboard. There's a whole different level of intimacy that I think has been really interesting to see how that plays out in the work that we do.
Right. But in certain other ways, did you feel ever that, there was a kind of, a screen between a physical screen, or that you were not able to read your clients' cues or, read their body language as well? Or, was it very seamless?
Yeah, I mean, so I was seeing a couple, and they were just really having trouble with each other, really having trouble understanding each other. And there was a lot of just upsetness between them. And then all of a sudden she softened toward him and she smiled. And I didn't know what had happened. And I had to ask, and I said, what just happened there? And she said, oh, he took my hand. But I didn't see that because it happened under the screen, right? So in the room, I would have watched that. I would have seen him reach out to her, take her hand, her whole body just melt into him. But I didn't see that. So I had to ask. So I think, that's one of the things that you don't get, is you don't get the whole, there's certain things that you're going to miss when it's mediated by a little box on the screen.
Right.
Hi, my name is Anshna. Laurie, it's a pleasure to be talking to you. So reading your book, it was very interesting to see you be vulnerable as a client in front of a therapist, as well as you seeing clients as well. And studying therapy or having to be in a therapeutic space, there's a lot of conversation around setting the right kind of boundaries. And now that so many of your clients have potentially read your book, how has that shifted for you when they come into your space as a client?
Oh, great question.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. I can't actually see you, but I could hear you. That's really interesting because since you read the book, that once I canceled the happiness book and decided not to write that, what I really wanted to do was just bring people into the therapy room so they could see the human condition, really, because I think it's so beautiful to watch people go through things and then move through them. And it was really interesting because when I decided to do this other book, nobody wanted to buy this book, meaning the publishers. And they all said, who wants to read about people having conversations in a room together, which is not really what I think the book is. But so it was really interesting when, I thought, okay, well, maybe 3 people will read this, but at least it'll be, it will, I hope, serve some purpose for these 3 people. And then when I turned in the first draft to my publisher, they were like, oh my gosh, I laughed, I cried, I saw myself in it, I saw all the people I know in it. And they really had this reaction to it. And so I thought, maybe more people will read this than I expected. And maybe I should sort of clean myself up a little bit, because I was very raw and vulnerable and I just didn't hold anything back in writing about what I was going through. But I didn't do that. And I'm really glad that I didn't do that, because I think that the reason that so many people have read it and that it resonated so widely, all over the world, is because it is just the human condition. And I think that when we try to cover it up and when we try to hide it, it feels fake. It doesn't feel real. And so you asked about my patients and what happened when, they read the book. I didn't tell them that I've been a writer for a long time, and I don't tell them when I'm writing something. Obviously, the people in the book knew about it, and they were not people I was currently seeing because I felt those boundaries would be too blurred. And so I just said, I'm going away on book leave and I will be back in 2 weeks, and here's who's on call for me. And then when I came back after, I went and launched the book, some people came in and they sat on my couch and said, so I read your book. Right. But what was interesting was they weren't really interested in talking about me, right? They were interested in talking about them, and they were interested in talking about, they felt like they had permission to really talk about the relationship between us in a different way, because this book is all about my relationship with Wendell and my relationship with my clients. And I think the other thing was that it gave them permission to really go deeper. They really wanted to go deeper. They saw what the clients in the book had done, and they really wanted to do that work themselves. So I think it was actually a really positive thing for them to have read the book.
Laurie, hi, and thank you so much for this opportunity. I actually cannot believe I'm speaking to you, even though we can't see each other. I'm a huge fan of the book, so that's basically what I came up to say. And to everyone who hasn't got it yet, you should absolutely get the workbook, because I think it covers a lot of questions like what even Laurie was talking about and Shubhamdi was asking, right? But a question that I had, Laurie, was on the subject of patterns. And when we work on our own patterns and we try to sort of understand them and change them, what would you say? What was the advice you give someone who who kind of starts on that journey but kind of gets stuck repeatedly because there are a lot of things that come up for you that you don't want to see, or you think that, okay, now I'm in a better space, so I'm going to stop working on myself. But obviously,
Right.
it's like a process. You should continue. But what do you say to that person who kind of feels like, I want to take a pause now because I'm feeling so much better, but actually understands that there's so much more to do? How do you kind of unstuck yourself?
Yeah, I think this question of, and by the way, I can see you now. So thank you so much. I'm so glad that the book resonated with you and the workbook too. I think patterns are, these kind of ways of being in the world that keep us stuck. And I think that in the book, I talk a little bit about the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion. So idiot compassion is when you tell your friend, listen to what happened with my partner or my sibling or my mother or whatever it is, right? And the person you're talking to says, yes, they're wrong, you're right. That keeps you stuck in this pattern because you don't see your own role in the situation. And I think it's really important that, when we come to therapy, we don't give idiot compassion, we get wise compassion, which is we hold up a mirror to you and help you to see something about yourself that maybe you haven't been willing or able to see. But we do it with compassion. That's why the word compassion is there, because you can't change a pattern if you feel shame around it. So you have to be aware of it, and you have to be willing to look at your own role in it. And there's a chapter in the book called How Humans Change. And it's really about the stages of change. I think a lot of people think once I recognize my pattern, I'm going to easily be able to change that. But the problem is that with change comes loss. So even if that pattern isn't serving you, it's comfortable to you, it's familiar to you, it's something that you've been doing for a long time. And it's very hard to break out of that and do something new, even if it's going to be better for you, because we feel more comfortable doing the thing that we already know versus the thing that we don't know yet. And so the stages of change that I write about in the book are really important because they show you what are the different steps that you go through before you're actually ready to make a change. And, it starts with pre-contemplation, where you don't really know that you've got this pattern and you're going to make this change. And then contemplation, where you start thinking about it. And there's preparation, where you're preparing, like, how do I make this change? And then there's action, where we make the change. But that's not the last step. The last step is maintenance. And maintenance is the most important step, because it's how do we maintain the change? So you want to break a pattern, you make some changes toward that, right? But then how do I maintain that? And the mistake that people make is they think if they slip back into their pattern, their old pattern, that, that somehow they failed, and then they give up and they don't keep trying to change the pattern. The way you change a pattern is you keep doing the new behaviors, and then you'll fall back in maintenance. You're going to fall back, but then you get back up and you do the new pattern. So the more times you repeat the new pattern, the more that becomes the pattern that feels familiar, comfortable, and it doesn't feel so foreign anymore. And then that becomes the pattern that you want to do. And the old pattern starts to feel uncomfortable. You see, so you're replacing one with the other. So I think it's really important for people to read that section in the book. And also there's a whole section in the workbook about this, because if you aren't aware of that, you're going to feel like you're failing, and you're not going to want to keep doing the work that you need to do to make that new pattern the one that you feel most comfortable with.
Well,
Hi there.
Hi, I'm Richa. Just a quick question. So for someone who has been through chronic depression and still going through it, but is an aspiring therapist, what would be one piece of advice that you would give?
I would say the most important piece of advice is to really do the work yourself. That it's, I talk in the book a little bit about this idea of, can we help our patients if we haven't done the work ourselves? And I think that the answer is you don't have to necessarily go as far as they are, right? But you have to be actively working on it. Obviously, it's easier to help somebody from, we have the vantage point of not living in their lives, right? So, there's that. But I also think that if you don't understand your history, if there's, any kind of lingering trauma, any kind of unresolved conflicts, unresolved relationships, those kinds of things, you really need to understand them more clearly, because what your patients are going through will bring up feelings in you. if you're doing the work well as a therapist. And so you really need to be aware of that. And you need to know what's theirs, what's yours, and whatever is yours, you need to know to separate that out and take that out of the room.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us. This was most illuminating. It was really a pleasure to talk to you. Laurie's book is available in the bookstore, and pick up a copy if you want to, if you think that you should talk to someone.